This case has stuck with me through the years. I grew up in the town where Catherine Winters disappeared, and lived less than a block from the Winters house. I vividly remember being told urban legends about the little girl who was buried in the walls, when driving by the house that was previously owned by the Winters family. I've heard locals talk about the flood that began the night of her disappearance. They tell stories of the old interurban and its destruction during the flood. Some will go as far as to claim her remains were placed in one of the interurban's bridges during repairs. I recently visited one of the sites of the old interurban to photograph the still-standing bridges. The area is much different now than it would have been during the time of Catherine's disappearance, but it is still easy to see how that location could have been used to carry out a horrific crime, undetected. The flood in itself killed many people. Could she have simply been another victim of the flood? I've heard stories that claim she was murdered by her evil stepmother, or that she was taken by gypsies, or that her kidnapper grabbed her and jumped on the interurban train with her. Those are the legends that keep this case alive. Now let's take a look at the facts. Catherine Winters was born on February 10, 1904 in Newcastle, Indiana. Her father, Dr. William Asa Winters, was a dentist who went by the nickname Doc. Catherine's mother, Emily Whistler, had passed away after contracting tuberculosis when Catherine was 5, and her brother, Frankie, was 2. Dr. Winters needed assistance with the care of the children after his wife died. His sister-in-law, Ida, and mother-in-law, Eliza, moved in to help. Bird Ophelia Ritter and her sisters worked at a hotel called the Bundy House, which was close to Dr. Winters' dental office. He was absolutely awestruck by Bird and married her on September 5, 1910. As a result of their disapproval of Bird, Catherine's Aunt Ida and grandmother moved into a nearby house. Bird was a complete stranger to them. Dr. Winters and Bird had not dated before they dove into marriage, and she attempted to instantly take on a role as the new mother of the 2 very young children. To make her power and place in Dr. Winters' life known, she went as far as to sue Ida and Eliza for back rent. Dr. Winters constructed a home on North 16th Street, in Newcastle. At that time the home was lavish, and was furnished with indoor plumbing, a telephone, and electricity. To everyone around her, Bird didn't appear to be an abusive stepmother. She used her talents as a seamstress to ensure the children always wore beautiful clothing. Catherine was always seen wearing beautiful dresses when she walked her dog. Behind closed doors the Winters family had turbulence. When the family's finances dwindled, they began taking in boarders. Dr. Winters indulged heavily in alcohol. Bird did not approve of his drinking, and went as far as to evict a boarder, William Ross Cooper, for drinking with her husband. Despite their struggles, for 3 years, the family continued to build a life, with some hint of normalcy. In 1913, Catherine's disappearance blindsided the family. Although Catherine's elementary school was closed, due to a measles outbreak, March 20, 1913, was an otherwise ordinary day. Bird had gone shopping for wallpaper, while her mother, Lydia, sat with Catherine, Frankie, and Jane. The girls had gotten permission from Lydia to go see Helen Stretch's new dollhouse. After seeing the new dollhouse, Lydia took Frankie along with her to visit neighbors, while Catherine and Jane went door to door selling sewing needles for their church's fundraiser. The girls were expected home by lunch, but Catherine never returned home. Jane reported to the family that she last saw Catherine walking down an alley toward Vine Street. She was dressed in her black and white gingham dress, a red sweater, and a red hair bow. Family friend Dan Monroe allegedly saw Catherine on Broad Street near her father's office. Dan and Catherine had briefly stopped to say hello before parting ways. Dan and other locals stated that a band of Romany travelers had stopped to rest near Catherine's last known whereabouts. As the evening approached, Bird called the police to report Catherine kidnapped or missing. Heavy rains descended on the town. Around the same time the search for Catherine started. This was the first storm of what would be a historic system of storms that tore through the Midwest, flooding cities large and small, washing away roads, train tracks, and telephone wires, killing hundreds, and stranding many thousands more. The floodwaters rose to as high as 40 feet, and as many as 60,000 buildings were destroyed. The weather bogged down the first search parties, sucking their motor cars into the mud. The weather dominated headlines, and distracted everyone from the immediate task of finding Catherine Winters. As the storms raged on, Dr. Winters was panicked and convinced that Catherine had been kidnapped by gypsies. A local automobile dealership loaned vehicles to Dr. Winters as well as to the police, to aid in the search for Catherine. After hours of traveling through mud, they located the so-called gypsies. The group politely gave Dr. Winters and the police their full cooperation, and allowed a complete search of the area, as well as of their belongings. Even after searching the Romany belongings, Dr. Winters was still convinced they had kidnapped Catherine. He convinced the police to go along with him again to search once again. Dr. Winters confronted Adolf John Spires, who had appeared to be in command of the group. Adolf opened his door to expose 9 children inside. Adolf said, "Don't you think I have enough children?" Dr. Winters offered a $100 reward for the return of his daughter. Adolf also offered $1,000. Dr. Winters frantically searched the streets of New Castle for hours in the pouring rain, but he found no signs of Catherine. At this point, the town had begun to flood. By March 24, Catherine's whereabouts were still unknown, despite the efforts to locate her. Local businesses closed so employees could help search. Hundreds of Newcastle citizens walked and drove through floodwaters and rain to search for Catherine. They searched through one another's homes, businesses, outhouses, and gardens until there was nothing left to investigate, but found no trace of Catherine Winters. Authorities believed that if Catherine were killed in the flood, searchers would have found her body. The locals formed a committee to execute an extended search for Catherine. They knew they needed help, so the committee raised the funds needed to hire a private investigator named Harry Webster. Mr. Webster discovered that when Catherine's mother died, her children became heirs to around $6,000. Catherine alone was worth half of that, which translates to approximately $78,216.67 in today's economy. Webster hypothesized that Catherine's maternal family had kidnapped her for financial gain, and had taken her to Wisconsin. Webster investigated Catherine's relatives, but his inquiry only absolved them of any involvement. Why would they have taken Catherine and left Frankie, who was worth just as much, behind? Webster had worked meticulously for nearly a month to locate Catherine, to no avail. The committee was unable to offer him the funds he required to continue, so he quit. In response, the committee next hired Detective Alfred Lunt, of the Distinguished Burns Detective Agency. Dr. Winters was unwilling to consider any other suspects outside of the Romany travelers, and Lunt was confident they had no involvement in Catherine's disappearance. Still, Dr. Winters dispatched Detective Lunt to locate the caravan a 4th time, with the same result. The committee couldn't pay Mr. Lunt either, so he quit in August. By this point, the disappearance of Catherine Winters was national news. People all over the country contributed to Catherine Winters' reward fund, and offered tips. Newspapers continued to report events in the home. Dr. Winters and Bird were in control of the investigation, when the police should have been. When Catherine had gone missing, the authorities met in the Winters home. Anyone in the home, including the boarders, was able to hear everything that was said between Catherine's parents and law enforcement. Newspapers had gone as far as publishing the Winters phone number, so anyone who had a tip could call the Winters directly, instead of the police. Many people had phoned claiming to be Catherine or claiming to have seen Catherine, either in person or in visions. Dr. Winters would take the train to investigate each lead, but he always returned disappointed. By the following fall, prosecutor Herbert Evans became suspicious of how quickly Dr. Winters and Bird were to accuse the Gypsies, or the Whistler family, without any evidence. Newcastle Chief of Police, James Buslog, realized the Winters family had never been investigated, and thought the family knew more than they were willing to admit. On October 6, 1913, a grand jury, presided over by Judge Ed Jackson, was assembled. When the judge subpoenaed 6-year-old Frankie Winters to testify, Dr. Winters had become infuriated. He begged Judge Jackson to spare Frankie from providing painful testimony, but he was not successful in his attempts. While Frankie was on the stand, Dr. Winters had nervously paced the streets in a drunken frenzy, shouting and shaking his fists. A crowd of reporters waited each day, outside of the courthouse as jurors and witnesses walked in and out. There was one witness the press refused to identify. All they would print is that his testimony could break the case wide open. Judge Jackson heard hundreds of statements and soon realized he had not been presented with anything he couldn't have read in the newspaper. Due to the lack of physical evidence or a real suspect, Judge Jackson halted the proceedings before he could hear the testimony of the touted, unnamed star witness. Walter Myers, who was a freshly graduated lawyer, with limited experience and a reputation for failing to get charges to stick, took over for the prosecution. In November, the headlines covering the election overshadowed those of the missing girl from Newcastle, and no new evidence resurfaced. Catherine's case started to get cold. Dr. Winters created a short film portraying Catherine's story. He traveled throughout Indiana, showing the movie in theaters with a 10-cent admission. Most of the profits went to the private committee investigating her disappearance. In the spring of 1914, Newcastle Mayor James Leb Watkins feared Catherine's case was growing cold. Journalists had become reluctant in publishing her story. Watkins hoped to revive the case, so he hired Detective Robert Abel of the Louis Ween Detective Agency. Abel did not ask for payment. He only asked for reimbursement for expenses. Abel conducted an aggressive investigation. He traveled to Illinois to interview Dr. Winters' brother. What Winters' brother had told him is unknown, but when he returned to Newcastle, Abel stated, "I have reason to believe Catherine's body is in the Winters basement." On Memorial Day of 1914, Dr. Winters and Bird traveled to Terre Haute for a showing of Catherine's film. Abel went to the Winters home with local police officers, with a search warrant. He knocked, and Lydia allowed the men inside. Abel and the officers dug in the basement behind the furnace, and observed a cinder block with something stuffed inside. Abel reached in and carefully retrieved a child's red sweater, with a singed nape. Inserted inside of the sweater was a big, red, double-bowed hair ribbon. Abel also discovered a man's shirt with evident bloodstains, and an unusual crease at the shoulder of the sleeve. The creasing reminded everyone of the recently evicted William Ross Cooper. Ross's left arm had been amputated after an accident years before. In the Winters bedroom, police uncovered suspicious letters from one household member to another. Newspapers named the author of these letters as Catherine's stepmother, Bird. Locals gossiped that they were love letters to Ross. Abel had carefully studied the letters, and began to suspect that Bird and Ross were lovers. He surmised that Catherine had somehow found out about the affair, and that either Bird, Dr. Winters, or Ross had caused her disappearance, in an attempt to protect the family name. The three suspects were arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit a felony, based exclusively on the physical evidence uncovered in the search. The judge set bail for both Dr. Winters and Bird at $5,000 each. Ross's bail was set at $6,000. Dr. Winters and Bird paid their bail and were out before they were ever actually in jail. However, Ross was unable to afford his bail. When Bird was questioned, she stated the sweater had belonged to her nephew, who had recently moved to California. She went on to say, "The bloody shirt may or may not have belonged to Ross, but even if it did, it didn't matter because the blood wasn't human." She claimed that her cat delivered a litter of kittens, and the blood from the labor had soiled the shirt, and she had decided to throw it into the basement, for disposal at a later date. Abel had already provided the shirt to a local chemist for analysis, whose findings proved the blood was provided by a human source. The chemist also stated that the blood was around a year old. Abel urged the newly appointed prosecutor to enhance the charges, to murder and rearrest Bird and Dr. Winters, but Myers declined. Despite Abel's claims of damning evidence, which was the result of a tip in Illinois, Myers knew he did not have enough evidence to properly try the case. The ribbon, letters, sweater, and blood-stained shirt were the only physical evidence that the prosecution had. These items were stored in a safe in Mayor Watkins' home. At a later date, investigators had returned to examine the evidence, but it was missing. No one knew where it had gone. Without a shred of physical evidence, Investigators were left with only Abel's word. Myers was forced to drop the charges. Frustrated, Detective Abel quit the case on the spot without even investigating his Illinois clue. Abel's cryptic tip originated from Mount Hope Cemetery in Urbana, Illinois. A short time after Catherine disappeared, an anonymous man left the remains of a female child with cemetery caretaker, Theodore Brown. The head man claimed the child was his daughter, who had passed away, due to the complication of an illness. He stated that he did not have the money that would be required to provide her a proper burial. The man asked Theodore if he would store her remains until he could afford a funeral. The man did not provide any form of identification or paperwork, such as a death certificate. The caretaker sympathized with the man, and against his better judgment, he decided to place the child in a cemetery vault. The man never returned for her. The unidentified child could not be allowed to remain in the vault forever, so she was buried in a plain pine box, in an unmarked grave a few weeks later. Theodore soon suspected the remains might be those of Catherine Winters. In July of 1914, Newcastle officer Thomas Romine and County Treasurer John Wallace went to investigate the caretaker's claims. John was a close friend of the Winters and knew Catherine well. If this were Catherine, John would have the ability to identify her without any doubts. Champaign County Sheriff Davis, alongside the county coroner, was present during the exhumation. The remains were confirmed to have had the same secondary teeth as Catherine. One of the lower incisors had been fitted with a gold crown. Catherine was the daughter of a dentist and had an identical gold crown. The remains were clothed in a black and white gingham dress, just like Catherine was last seen wearing, on the day she disappeared. The body had bruising on its face, that the coroner labeled as suspicious. They confirmed the identification as definite and announced that the search for Catherine Winters had ended. Dr. Winters immediately sent his friend, Dr. J. E. Hyatt, and a neighbor, Mr. Barber, in his place. Dr. Hyatt had attended Catherine's birth. Dr. Winters had ruled out many little girls, from all over the country, both living and deceased, as being his daughter. He refused to take part in ruling out the remains of this child. As Dr. Hyatt and Barber arrived, they were met at Mount Hope by a man named Nicholas Larry. He insisted it was not Catherine buried there, but was his daughter, Marjorie. Marjorie was only 3 at the time of her passing, and much smaller than 9-year-old Catherine. Marjorie was a tow-headed blonde, and Catherine had light brown hair. Larry, Dr. Hyatt, and Barber viewed the body together. If the remains were in fact Marjorie, it would be immediately evident. When they arrived in the back room where the plain pine box was placed, it wasn't there. Now, there was a tiny copper coffin. The remains inside were completely lacking secondary teeth. Instead, they found a mouthful of baby teeth. None of the teeth were crowned. Larry could not provide a death certificate but signed a statement swearing the child was his daughter. Larry was a lawyer and not the type of individual who would be unable to afford a funeral or a man who lacked the knowledge to realize he would need a death certificate. The conclusive identification made by Sheriff Davis, Dr. Hyatt, John Wallace, and the coroner Hanmore was entirely discounted. Confused Sheriff Davis commented to reporters, "If you knew 1/10 of what I know." After the identification, no one discussed the child buried in Urbana. In December of 1914, someone unearthed that same little girl again. The grave was gone, as if there had never been a person buried in that location, and there are no records to explain where her remains had gone. Like all of the other physical evidence, the remains had seemingly disappeared. An explanation might be present, in the 2 weeks before Catherine's disappearance. An unidentified man in a rented buggy had abducted and raped 8-year-old Helen Milliken, who lived alarmingly close to the Winters home. When Helen was located, authorities reported that the man had given her some change and dropped her off in town. Another possible lead can be found in May 1913, 2 months after Catherine disappeared, when a man attempted to lure Charlotte Thomas, an 8-year-old, into a dilapidated buggy, but a scrappy male child had intervened. In September 1913, 51-year-old Barney Carpenter was arrested after he coaxed 2 female children into a Newcastle greenhouse and sexually molested them. Beforehand, Barney stood out as one of the hardest working men in the search party. The day after Barney's arrest, his wife told the police she planned to divorce the man, because of a mania to insult little girls. Because Barney was a Newcastle resident, Catherine likely knew him. Barney had a history of being inappropriate with little girls, so when Catherine was going door to door trying to sell her sewing needles, she would have been an easy target for a predator. Police searched his home but found nothing incriminating, and pursued the theory that Bird, Dr. Winters, and Ross had committed the crime. No other suspects could influence investigators enough to ignore the evidence found in the Winters home. According to the book, Looking for Catherine, Memoirs of a House That Spoke, Newcastle author and historian Catherine Z. Perry and her daughter, author Lisa Perry Martin, an anonymous letter published in a 1921 newspaper claimed the Mount Hope child was indeed Catherine. Al Sherry, a 71-year-old employee of the Big Four Railway in Newcastle, told several people that he had inadvertently shipped Catherine's remains and documented it. In 2017, a 10-page-long document was found at the Henry County Historical Society. No one knows who wrote the text, but the author states that Ross Cooper shipped a child's coffin-sized package to himself in another state just days after Catherine's disappearance. It is a copy of a handwritten document, unsigned, and undated. The writer recounts a story told by Cooper's boss, 40 years after Catherine's disappearance. Al Sherry ran a now long-gone railroad depot. He remembered Cooper shipping boxes out of state to himself. He suspected they held Catherine's remains. According to a Fox 59 article, "From everything we've learned he was a very mean, intimidating person," Pitts said. He scared people. Pitts thinks he's discovered the writer's identity. The account matches evidence and stories told at the time. "I've always believed that Catherine made it home that day and something happened to her after she got home. But others believe Catherine was taken by a child predator." Newcastle newspapers had reported that 2 girls were taken from the streets about the time Catherine vanished. This new evidence seems to leave us with even more unanswered questions. During the years following Catherine's disappearance, Frankie Winters moved to California as soon as he came of age, where he died at just 49 years old. Dr. Winters drank himself to death in 1940, and Bird lived to be 72. The Winters family never lived down the stigma of their possible involvement in Catherine's disappearance, which is still a hot-button issue in Newcastle. Dr. Winters' last words were, "Now I'll know what happened to my dear Catherine." This case will likely never be solved, due to the passing of time. What do you think happened to Catherine? Please comment below. We hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe to our channel.